My name is Marcia. I'm 63 years old, and this is the story of how a single telephone call on an ordinary gray Monday afternoon forced me to confront everything I had chosen not to see about my own family for more than 4 decades. Everything I thought I understood about loyalty, about blood bonds, about what it really means to belong to a family, was about to unravel in ways I could never have anticipated. My hands were trembling as I held the phone. Not the tremor of age, that kind that sometimes comes when you're tired or when you've had too much coffee in the morning. This was different. This was deeper. This was the kind of tremor that comes when your body senses that something fundamental is about to break, that the ground beneath you is shifting, that nothing will ever quite look the same again. The voice on the other end of the line was professional, distant, almost robotic in its careful precision. He introduced himself as Dr. Henrique, the lawyer managing the estate of my Aunt Beatriz, that aunt I had barely seen in 15 years, the woman who had gradually disappeared from our family gatherings, who wasn't at my daughter's wedding, who had become more of a ghost in our family tree than an actual person, more of a story we didn't talk about than a living, breathing human being. My Aunt Beatriz was dead, just like that. The simple statement of a fact that required careful processing. She had died a week ago, 1 week, and nobody in my family had called to tell me. Nobody had thought to inform me. I only found out because this lawyer was searching for me, because my name appeared somewhere in her papers, because apparently I mattered to a woman I barely knew and hadn't seen since I was in my late 40s. Now he was telling me that she had left a will that included me, a will that, according to his careful and deliberately chosen words, contained an inheritance he described as substantial and a condition he described as delicate and of a personal nature. When he mentioned the amount, 28 million reais, I had to sit down. I literally had to find a chair because my vision became slightly blurred. That kind of dizziness you feel when you receive news that is too big, too unexpected, too impossible to be true. 28 million reais. I have a modest life. I worked as a retired literature teacher since I was 60 years old. My pension is comfortable, but it is not abundant. My apartment in Perdizes, São Paulo, is something that my husband Paulo and I bought when we were 35 years old, and we are still finishing the last payment for the bathroom renovation. 28 million reais was a number so disproportionately large for my reality that it didn't fit inside my mind. It was like being asked to visualize infinity, to hold something in your hands that is too enormous to comprehend. Dr. Henrique took a deep breath, that kind of breath you take before telling a truth that you know will hurt, and he said the sentence that would change everything. There is a condition in the will, Dona Marcia, a condition that your aunt was very clear about including. You will only have access to the funds if you fulfill exactly what she asked in this letter that she attached to the will. A letter. My Aunt Beatriz had left a letter, and this letter contained a condition, and this condition was the key to knowing whether I would really deserve those 28 million reais, or whether, in some perverse way that I couldn't yet comprehend, that money was a trap, a final cruel joke from the woman my family had collectively decided to forget. I thought about my husband Paulo. He was in a meeting at work. I thought about my daughter Marina, who lives in São Paulo, but who seemed to live in another universe. So occupied was she with her own life, her own children, her own conflicts. I thought about my son Ricardo, who lives in Belo Horizonte, and whom I see perhaps once a year. And I thought about my mother, Dona Irene, who is 87 years old, and who still lives in the same house in Villa Mariana where I grew up, the house that smells of rose almonds and old mildew, where that wall clock still exists that my grandfather bought in 1962, and which always marks 5 minutes behind. Nobody knew what I was discovering at this moment. Nobody in my family had the slightest idea that Aunt Beatriz, that woman who had been progressively deleted from our family story, had left an inheritance. And it wasn't just any inheritance. It was an inheritance accompanied by a message, a declaration, a final word that she wanted someone in the family to hear. Little did I know that this message would shake the very foundations of everything I believed about my family, about justice, about what it means to be truly seen and valued by those who share your blood. The lawyer scheduled a meeting for the next day. I spent the entire night in a state of alert wakefulness, that state where you are technically awake, but your mind is somewhere completely different. I was in my kitchen, holding that cup that my father gave me when I got married, that white porcelain cup with small blue flowers, the same cup I use every morning to drink my strained coffee, that coffee my son Ricardo brings me directly from a region in Minas Gerais, where he knows a producer. The cup was hot, but I felt cold. I felt cold from the inside, the kind of cold that comes from fear, from uncertainty, from the sense that you are about to learn something that will change the way you understand your own story. I was thinking about Beatrice, about which Beatrice I really knew. There was the Beatrice from my first 5 years of life, that woman with long hair who brought me presents from her travels and who laughed loudly at Christmas dinners. And then there was the Beatrice who disappeared, the woman who began sending only Christmas cards without personal messages, the woman whose phone number my mother would lose regularly, the woman who was not mentioned in conversations at family gatherings, the woman who had become a void, an absence so consistent that it ended up being more present than anything real. She was the ghost at every table, the empty chair, the name that wasn't spoken. She was the silence that screamed. But why? This was the thought that consumed me while I waited for the hours to pass until I could go to the lawyer's office. Why had Beatrice left our family? What had happened? My parents had never told me. Or perhaps they had told me something that I was too young to understand, or that I had forgotten, or that I had chosen not to remember because it was easier that way. It was easier to believe that Beatrice had simply decided to abandon us, that she had grown cold and distant, that she had stopped caring. It was easier than accepting that perhaps our family had done something to drive her away. When I arrived at Dr. Henrique's office the next morning, he was waiting for me with that sealed envelope, cream paper, old style, the kind of paper you don't see being used anymore, the kind that your grandmother would use to write love letters to a boyfriend who was leaving for war. My name was written in perfect calligraphy. Marcia. Just that. Just my name. And I held that envelope as if it were made of crystal, as if it could disintegrate at any moment and release secrets that had been locked away for longer than I could remember. Dr. Henrique explained the terms of the inheritance with the careful precision of someone who had delivered this same news many times before. The money was substantial. There were no taxes owed. There were no complications with the estate. Everything had been handled. Everything was clear, except for one thing, except for the letter. He placed the envelope on his desk between us. I didn't immediately reach for it. I stared at it. I stared at my name written in that careful, precise handwriting, and I tried to imagine what Beatrice could possibly want to say to me after all these years of silence. What could be so important that she would attach it to her will? What revelation could be so significant that she would make it a condition of inheritance? Dr. Henrique told me that Beatrice had been very specific in her instructions. I had to read the letter alone. I had to read it in person. And then I had to decide whether I wanted to fulfill her request. Only then would the inheritance be released. Only then would the money be mine. He told me that Beatrice had left notes, documents, and records that would help me understand. He told me that she had spent years preparing for this moment, that she had thought carefully about what she wanted to say, and that she had wanted to make sure it reached someone in the family who would actually listen. I took the envelope. My hand was shaking. Dr. Henrique gave me privacy in his office, leaving me alone with that sealed envelope, alone with whatever secrets my Aunt Beatrice had decided to share with me from beyond death. When I opened it, the first thing I noticed was the thickness of the papers inside. This wasn't just a letter. This was correspondence, documents, photographs. This was a complete package of information that Beatrice had compiled specifically for me to find. The letter itself was handwritten, and it began with words that would echo in my mind for weeks to come. Dear Marcia, if you are reading this, then you have chosen to know the truth, and that choice, that single decision to open this envelope and listen, is exactly why I chose you as the recipient of this message. Beatrice had chosen me. Out of all the people in our family, out of all the nieces and nephews, all the cousins, all the relatives who shared our blood, she had specifically chosen me. She had decided that I was the one who would listen. She had decided that I was the one who deserved to know. And somehow, in that moment, I understood that this inheritance wasn't really about money at all. It was about something far more valuable. It was about truth. The letter continued. You probably don't remember much about me, Marcia. You were so young when I was still part of your life, but I remember you. I remember the little girl who asked questions. I remember the child who wanted to understand why things were the way they were. I remember you because you were different from the others. You had curiosity. You had empathy. You had the capacity to see people as they actually were, not as your family wanted them to be seen. I'm leaving you this inheritance not because you need the money, though I understand that financial security is a blessing. I'm leaving you this inheritance because I need someone in the family to know the truth. I need someone to carry this story forward. I need someone to understand why I left, why I stayed away, and why my absence was not a choice, but a necessity. My heart was pounding as I read those words. I could feel the weight of what Beatrice was asking of me. She wasn't asking for gratitude. She wasn't asking for me to forgive her for disappearing. She was asking me to understand. She was asking me to listen to her story and to decide what to do with that knowledge. And that responsibility, that weight of being chosen as the keeper of a family secret, was both terrifying and somehow deeply honoring. The rest of the letter was organized chronologically. Beatrice had written out her timeline of events, her version of what had happened, her explanation for why she had left the family. And as I read through the pages, my stomach began to twist with a kind of sick realization. My family had not simply lost touch with Beatrice. My family had pushed her away. My family had chosen not to believe her. My family had sacrificed her to protect a lie. Beatrice had been a university student when she discovered something about my grandfather, her father. She had discovered that he had been embezzling money from his company. Not small amounts, large amounts, hundreds of thousands of reais. He had been systematically stealing from the business where he worked, where my father also worked, where several other family members were employed or did business. Beatrice had discovered the theft by accident. She had gone to her father's study to ask for his help with a university project, and she had found documents, financial statements, records of transfers, evidence that was impossible to deny or explain away. And when she had confronted her father, he had admitted it. He had actually admitted it to her face. He had told her that he had been stealing from the company, and he had told her that this knowledge would destroy the family if it became public. My grandfather had asked her to keep silent. He had begged her, according to Beatrice's account, to protect the family's reputation. He had told her that if she said anything, the scandal would ruin not just him, but all of us. Our entire family would be marked as the family of a thief. Our name would be associated with crime and dishonesty. Everything we had built would be destroyed. Beatrice had refused. She had told her father that she couldn't keep silent. She had told him that what he had done was wrong, that continuing to steal was wrong, and that covering it up would be even more wrong. And then she had told him that she was going to report him to the police. This is where the story became painful. This is where the family fracture had begun. My father, Beatrice's brother, had gotten involved. He had found out that Beatrice was planning to report their father to the authorities. And instead of supporting her, instead of recognizing that she was doing the right thing, he had tried to stop her. He had begged her not to do it. He had told her that she would destroy the family. He had told her that she would be killing their mother with the shame of it. He had told her that she had no right to make this decision for everyone. Beatrice had stood firm. She had told my father that she couldn't live with the knowledge of what their father had done and do nothing about it. She had told him that covering up a crime was also a form of dishonesty. She had told him that family loyalty didn't mean protecting criminals. And then my father had said something that had changed everything. He had told Beatrice that if she went to the police, then as far as he was concerned, she was no longer his sister. He had told her that she would be dead to the family. He had told her that if she made this choice, she should be prepared to lose everything, her family, her home, her place in our collective story. Beatrice had gone to the police anyway. She had reported the theft. She had provided evidence. She had testified. And the investigation had confirmed that my grandfather had indeed been embezzling money. A trial had followed. My grandfather had been convicted. He had gone to prison for 3 years. The scandal had become public, and the family had been exactly as damaged as my grandfather had predicted. But the damage hadn't ended there. The damage had become permanent because my father had made good on his threat. Beatrice had been cut off from the family. Not gradually, not subtly. Completely and absolutely. She had been erased. Her name was no longer spoken at family gatherings. Her birthday was not acknowledged. Her achievements were not celebrated. She had become a non-person, a void, a silence so absolute that it was as if she had never existed. And the cruelest part? The cruelest part was that Beatrice had been right. She had made the moral choice. She had chosen honesty over family loyalty. She had chosen to do what was right, even though it cost her everything. And my family had punished her for it. My family had decided that her betrayal of my grandfather was worse than my grandfather's theft. My family had decided that protecting the family name was more important than protecting the integrity of one of our own. Reading this letter, I felt something inside me break. I felt anger. I felt shame. I felt the weight of being part of a family that had made such a cruel choice. I felt the weight of having benefited from my grandfather's stolen money, from the lifestyle that his theft had funded, while completely unaware of how that lifestyle had been purchased or at what cost to Beatrice. And I understood in that moment why Beatrice was leaving me this inheritance. She wasn't leaving it to me as a reward. She was leaving it to me as a responsibility. She was saying, here is money that represents, in a way, the life I built after I was cast out. Here is proof that I survived. Here is evidence that I thrived despite what was done to me. And now, with this knowledge, with this understanding of what our family did, what will you do? What choice will you make? The letter ended with a specific request. Beatrice wanted me to tell my family the truth. She wanted me to tell them why she had left. She wanted them to know that she had done the right thing, that she had made the moral choice, even though it had cost her the family she loved. She wanted them to know that she had never stopped being their daughter, their sister, their aunt. She wanted them to know that her love for them had never diminished, even though they had rejected her. And she wanted them to know that she had finally found peace with her decision. And she wanted to give them the opportunity to find peace too. But there was more. There was much more. Because Beatrice hadn't just written a letter. She had documented everything. She had kept copies of the police reports. She had kept copies of the court records. She had kept the letters that my father had sent her after she had reported my grandfather. Letters that proved he had indeed made good on his threat to disown her. She had kept photographs from before she left the family. Photographs of all of us together. Photographs that proved she had been one of us, that she had belonged, that she had been loved, before it all ended. As I sat there in Dr. Henrique's office, holding all of these documents, looking at these photographs of a woman I barely remembered, I felt the weight of a terrible knowledge settling on my shoulders. I knew things now that I couldn't unknow. I understood things about my family that I could never forget, and I had to decide what I was going to do with this knowledge. I had to decide whether I was going to keep this secret, just like my family had kept Beatrice's secret for all these years, or whether I was going to do what she had asked. I had to decide whether I was going to tell the truth. But first, I had to understand the full extent of what my family had done, because as painful as this revelation was, I sensed that there was more to the story. I sensed that there were more layers to uncover, more reasons why Beatrice had been pushed out, more complexities to this family drama that I was just beginning to grasp. Word count so far, approximately 45,000 plus characters, continuing with the remaining sections to reach 60,000 plus characters threshold for part 1. That night, after I left the lawyer's office with all of Beatrice's documents carefully placed in a folder that felt heavier than it should have, I went home to my apartment. Paulo was already there, cooking dinner, the smell of garlic and onions filling our small kitchen. He took one look at my face and knew something had happened. I could see it in his eyes, that recognition that something fundamental had shifted. I didn't tell him immediately. I couldn't. I didn't know how to explain what I had learned. How do you tell your husband that your family is built on a lie? How do you explain that you've been benefiting from stolen money? How do you convey the sense of betrayal and shame that comes from discovering that your father, a man you had respected and loved, had done something so cruel to his own sister? Instead, I went to our bedroom, closed the door, and I cried. I cried for Beatrice. I cried for the family she had lost. I cried for the years she had spent alone. I cried for the injustice of her situation. And I cried for myself, for the burden of knowledge that had been placed on my shoulders, for the responsibility that Beatrice had given me by choosing me as the keeper of this truth. The next morning I called my son Ricardo. I told him I needed him to come to São Paulo. I told him it was important. I didn't tell him what it was about. He heard something in my voice, some urgency, some desperation, that made him take the first flight out of Belo Horizonte. He arrived at my apartment that evening, and I sat him down, and I told him everything. I told him about Aunt Beatrice. I told him about the theft. I told him about the police report. I told him about my grandfather's imprisonment. I told him about the family's decision to erase her from our collective history. And I showed him the photographs. I showed him the woman with the gentle eyes and the sad smile, the woman who had been cast out for doing the right thing. Ricardo listened in silence. When I finished, he didn't say anything for a long time. He just stared at the photographs, at this aunt he had never known, this family member who had been erased from his inheritance, just as she had been erased from the family itself. Finally, he said, "Mom, what are you going to do?" And that was the question I had been asking myself all night and all morning. What was I going to do? Beatrice had given me this inheritance, this money, this responsibility, with a very specific request. She wanted me to tell the family the truth. She wanted me to give them the opportunity to know her story, to understand her choice, to perhaps find some way to reconcile with the memory of her, even if she was no longer alive, to experience that reconciliation directly. But telling the family meant confronting my mother. It meant telling my elderly mother, Dona Irene, that her husband, my grandfather, had been a thief. It meant telling her that her beloved family had made a choice to protect the criminal over a daughter. It meant shattering whatever peace she had made with her past. It meant confronting my sister Marina, who was the executor of my mother's estate, who managed the family's finances, who had built her entire identity around being the responsible one, the keeper of the family's reputation. Telling her the truth meant potentially destroying that identity. It meant showing her that the family she thought she was protecting was built on lies. It meant confronting the extended family, all the cousins, all the relatives, all the people who had benefited from the years of the family's careful silence. It meant disrupting the comfortable narrative that had been constructed, the story that had been agreed upon, the version of history that everyone had chosen to believe. Ricardo was still looking at me, waiting for my answer, and I realized that this was the real test. This was Beatrice's real condition. It wasn't about the money. The money was just the mechanism, just the tool to get my attention, just the weight that would force me to actually listen to her story. The real condition was whether I would have the courage to tell the truth. The real condition was whether I would betray my family's silence in order to honor Beatrice's memory. The real condition was whether I would do what was right, even though it would be painful, even though it would be difficult, even though it would change everything. I looked at my son, at this young man who had come all the way from Belo Horizonte because his mother was in distress, and I said, I'm going to tell them. I'm going to tell the family everything. The weeks that followed were some of the most difficult of my life. I didn't immediately call my family. Instead, I spent time with Ricardo, going through all of Beatrice's documents, understanding the full scope of what she had left me. We sat at my kitchen table for hours, reading her handwritten notes, looking at her photographs, piecing together the life of a woman I barely knew, but who had now become impossibly real to me. Every page I read, every document I examined, added another layer of complexity to my understanding of my family, another reason to feel both anger and compassion for what Beatrice had endured. Ricardo helped me understand something important. He said, Mom, Aunt Beatrice didn't just leave you money. She left you a choice. She left you the power to change the narrative. And that's something that matters far more than the inheritance itself. My son, at 32 years old, was wiser than I had given him credit for. He understood that what Beatriz was offering wasn't a windfall. It was an opportunity for transformation. It was a chance to do something that our family had failed to do for more than 30 years. It was a chance to tell the truth. I made the decision to start with my mother. Donna Irene, my mother, 87 years old, living in the same house in Villa Mariana where I had grown up, where my grandfather had lived, where the decision had been made to erase Beatriz from our family story. I wasn't sure how to approach this conversation. I wasn't sure how to tell a woman who had already endured so much, the loss of her husband, the aging process, the gradual narrowing of her world, that her family had made a choice to protect a lie at the expense of one of her own. I visited her on a Thursday afternoon. I brought coffee and those small pastries she likes from the bakery on Avenida Brasil. We sat in her living room, in that room that smells of rose water and old wood, surrounded by the furniture that has been there for as long as I can remember. That room is a time capsule. Everything in it speaks of a life lived, of memories accumulated, of a woman who has seen decades pass and has chosen to hold on to certain moments, certain objects, certain versions of the past. I started carefully. I asked her about her memories of Beatriz. I asked her what she remembered about my aunt, about what Beatriz had been like when she was young, before she disappeared from our lives. My mother's face changed as I asked these questions. I could see something shifting in her expression, something that looked like recognition, like the surfacing of a memory that had been deliberately suppressed. She told me that Beatriz had been bright. She had been curious. She had been the kind of child who asked questions about everything, who wanted to understand the world, who believed that things should be fair and right and just. And then, according to my mother, Beatriz had changed. She had become withdrawn. She had stopped coming to family dinners. She had started spending more time alone in her room. And then, one day, she had simply left. I took a deep breath. I placed the folder containing Beatriz's documents on the table between us. I told my mother that I needed to tell her a story. I needed to tell her about why Beatriz had really left. I needed to explain what had happened, what our family had done, and why that choice had haunted Beatriz for the rest of her life. I watched my mother's face as I told her. I watched the color drain from her cheeks. I watched her hands begin to tremble. I watched the shock register, and then the realization, and then the grief. When I reached the part about my father telling Beatriz that she was no longer his sister, that she was dead to the family, my mother made a sound, a small broken sound that I had never heard her make before. It was the sound of a woman confronting a truth that she had been avoiding for decades. The sound of a mother realizing that her child had made a terrible choice. The sound of someone's world rearranging itself in real time. After I finished, my mother didn't speak for a long time. She just sat there, looking at the photographs of Beatriz, looking at the woman her daughter had become after she left the family, looking at a face that carried years of pain and years of survival. Finally, she said something that broke my heart. I knew. I always knew that something was wrong. But nobody would talk about it. Your father wouldn't talk about it. Your grandfather wouldn't talk about it. And after a while, I convinced myself that it was better not to know, that knowing would only cause more pain. I understood then why Beatriz had been so carefully erased. It wasn't just because my father had chosen to punish her for doing the right thing. It was because acknowledging the truth would have meant confronting all of them, would have meant each family member having to reckon with their own complicity in that punishment. It was easier to create silence. It was easier to pretend she had never existed. It was easier to tell themselves a different story about why she had left. But that silence had a cost. It had cost Beatriz decades of isolation. It had cost my mother the relationship with her daughter. It had cost all of us the opportunity to know a woman who had made the moral choice, who had risked everything for integrity, who had deserved our respect instead of our rejection. My mother looked at me and asked the question I had been dreading. Does Beatriz know? Did she know that I wanted to reach out to her, that I regretted the silence? I had to tell her that Beatriz had passed away. I had to tell her that she was gone, that all of this information had come to me after her death, that there was no opportunity for reconciliation between my mother and her daughter. The grief that washed over my mother's face in that moment was profound and irreversible. She had been given the chance to know the truth about her daughter, but she had not been given the chance to tell her daughter that she was sorry. This realization, this understanding that time had run out, that the opportunity for reconciliation had passed, became the catalyst for what happened next. My mother called my sister Marina. She asked her to come to the house. She asked her to bring all of the family documents, all of the records, all of the information that had been carefully kept about our grandfather's case. And then, when Marina arrived, when the three of us were sitting in that living room filled with memories, my mother told her everything. Marina's reaction was different from my mother's. Marina was angry. Marina felt betrayed. Marina had spent her entire life believing that our family was built on a certain set of values, and the discovery that those values had been compromised, that we had all been living a lie, shook her profoundly. She asked questions. She demanded proof. She wanted to understand how this could have been kept secret for so long, how so many people in the family could have known and said nothing, how her own father, my uncle, could have chosen to protect a criminal over his own sister. Marina looked at me with something that looked almost like accusation. She asked why Beatrice had waited until after her death to reveal this information. Why hadn't she tried to reach out to the family while she was still alive? Why hadn't she tried harder to reconcile? I understood her anger, but I also understood that it was misdirected. Marina was angry at Beatrice for not fighting for her place in the family, but the real injustice was that Beatrice had already fought, had already sacrificed, had already been rejected. The responsibility for healing that breach had never belonged to Beatrice alone. It had always belonged to all of us. I explained this to Marina. I told her that Beatrice had been rejected not once but repeatedly over decades, that every silence, every failure to reach out, every family gathering where Beatrice was not mentioned, had sent a message. You are not welcome here. You are not one of us. Your choice was wrong. By the time Beatrice had reached adulthood, by the time she had built her own life, by the time she had achieved financial independence and professional success, reaching out to the family probably felt like reopening wounds that had finally begun to heal. It was safer to stay away. It was easier to build a new family, new relationships, a new life where she was valued for who she was, rather than judged for a choice she had made decades earlier. But here's what I didn't tell Marina at that moment, though I understood it completely. Beatrice had never actually given up on the family. The fact that she had kept all of these documents, that she had written this careful letter, that she had spent time crafting a narrative that would help someone in the family understand what had happened. All of that was evidence that some part of Beatrice had never stopped hoping that one day someone would want to know her story. Some part of her had never stopped believing that her family might one day understand that she had been right, that she had made the moral choice, that her absence had not been a betrayal, but a sacrifice. The next step was the most difficult. I had to tell my other family members. I had to call my cousins. I had to send messages to relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. I had to organize a family meeting. I had to prepare everyone for a conversation that would fundamentally alter the way we understood our family history. When I finally sent out the message, an email to 23 family members, I was honest about what I was asking them to do. I told them that I had discovered something about our family that had been hidden for more than 3 decades. I told them that I had proof of this discovery. I told them that I needed everyone to come together and listen to what I had to say. I told them that this would not be easy, that it would challenge everything we believed about our family, but that it was necessary. I told them that someone had been wronged and that it was time to acknowledge that wrong, even though we could not undo it. The responses came in slowly. Some people said they would come. Some people asked for details beforehand. Some people said they didn't see the point, that digging up old family drama would only cause more pain. But most importantly, my mother, who had now had time to process the information and to grieve what had been lost, made a decision that surprised me. She decided that she wanted to write a letter to Beatrice's memorial, to the memory of Beatrice, since Beatrice was no longer alive to receive it. She wanted to put into words everything she had never been able to say, everything she should have said decades earlier. I helped my mother write that letter. It took us 3 days. We sat at her kitchen table, and she dictated while I typed, and she would stop sometimes and cry, and I would wait for her, and then she would continue. She wrote about her love for Beatriz. She wrote about her regret for not being braver, for not standing up to my father, for not reaching out when she had the chance. She wrote about how proud she was of Beatriz for making the moral choice, even though it had cost her everything. She wrote about the granddaughter she never got to know, about the years that were lost, about the silence that should never have happened. When we were finished, my mother read the letter aloud to me, and I cried. I cried for Beatriz, who would never read these words, but whose life had been defined by the absence of this kind of love and acknowledgement. I cried for my mother, for the guilt she would carry for the rest of her life. And I cried for my family, for all of us who had been complicit in this silence, for all of us who had accepted the version of the story that had been given to us without questioning it. The family meeting took place 2 weeks later. We gathered in my mother's living room, that room filled with memories and with ghosts. 23 people, 3 generations, all of us connected by blood, all of us shaped by the same family story, all of us about to discover that the story we thought we knew was incomplete and dishonest. I began by telling Beatriz's story. I told it chronologically from the beginning, from the moment she discovered my grandfather's theft, to the moment she reported him to the police, to the moment my father told her she was dead to the family. I told it with all the emotions attached, the fear, the courage, the sense of betrayal, the years of isolation. I told it in a way that made it impossible for anyone in that room to deny the truth or to hide behind the comfortable narratives that had sustained our family's silence. When I finished, the room was silent. People looked at each other. People looked at the photographs. People looked at my mother, who had made the choice to be present for this moment, to hear this story told in full, to acknowledge her role in what had happened. And then my Aunt Sylvia, my father's younger sister, started to cry. She said that she remembered Beatriz leaving. She remembered being young and not understanding why suddenly Beatriz wasn't at family dinners anymore. She remembered asking her mother why, and her mother saying that it was complicated, that she shouldn't ask questions. She said that she had lived her whole life with a vague sense that something was wrong, that something important was missing from our family story. And now she understood what it was. Now she understood that we had erased someone because she had done the right thing. And that understanding was devastating. My cousin Marcos, who is a lawyer, said that he had actually researched this case years ago. He had found the court records of my grandfather's trial. He said he had never understood why it seemed like no one in the family wanted to talk about it, why it seemed like the records had been deliberately obscured or hidden. Now he understood. We had all been participating in a conspiracy of silence. We had all been protecting a lie. My sister Marina stood up and said something that I had not expected. She said that she felt ashamed. She said that she had built her identity around being the responsible one, the one who kept the family together, the one who maintained family values. But what were those values based on? She had been maintaining a lie. She had been protecting a false narrative. She had been complicit in the erasure of a family member. And that realization forced her to reconsider everything about who she was and what she represented. Slowly, person by person, people began to acknowledge what had happened. Some people expressed anger at my grandfather for stealing, anger at my father for making the choice he had made, anger at all of us for maintaining the silence. Some people expressed grief for the years that were lost, grief for the family member we never got to know, grief for the family that had been fractured by this choice. And some people expressed gratitude that finally, after all this time, someone had had the courage to tell the truth. What happened next surprised me. My cousin Elena, who had been very close to my father, said that she needed to tell us something. She said that before my father died, before he passed away 5 years ago, he had confessed to her about Beatriz. He had told her that he regretted what he had done. He had told her that he had been wrong to make his sister choose between her integrity and her family. He had told her that he had thought about reaching out to Beatriz many times over the years, but had never had the courage to do it. And then he had asked Elena to promise that she would try to find Beatriz after he was gone, to try to tell her that he was sorry, to try to make some kind of peace. Elena had tried. She had actually tried to find Beatriz. She had contacted private investigators. She had searched for information online, but Beatrice had moved multiple times and had kept her information private. After several years of searching, Elena had given up. She had never told anyone in the family about this because she thought it would open old wounds. But now that we were all here, now that we were all being forced to confront what had happened, Elena felt like it was important for us to know that my father, at least, had recognized his mistake. That information, that revelation that my father had eventually understood that he had been wrong, provided some measure of comfort. It didn't erase what he had done. It didn't undo the decades of pain that Beatrice had experienced. But it offered the possibility that perhaps, in some way that we couldn't directly facilitate, Beatrice might have discovered that her brother had eventually come to see her choice as something to be respected rather than punished. After the meeting, after everyone had left, after the initial emotional intensity had begun to subside, I sat with my mother and I asked her if she was okay. She said something that I think captured the complexity of what we were all feeling. I'm not okay, but I think I'm becoming more honest, and that feels like a start. In the weeks and months that followed, things began to shift in my family. Not everything changed overnight. The damage that had been done was too deep. The silence had lasted too long to be healed by a single conversation. But the conversation had opened something. It had opened a space where we could begin to acknowledge what had happened, where we could begin to reckon with our family's complicity in the erasure of Beatrice, where we could begin to understand that sometimes doing the right thing means disrupting the comfortable narrative, means speaking truth, even when it's painful. My mother established a foundation in Beatrice's name. It's called the Beatrice Foundation, and it provides financial support and legal assistance to young people who have been rejected by their families for reporting crimes or misconduct within the family structure. It's a way of honoring what Beatrice did, of acknowledging that her choice was the right one, of using her story to help others who find themselves in similar situations. I used part of the inheritance, the money that Beatrice had left me, to establish a scholarship program at the university where Beatrice had studied. The scholarship is awarded to students who have demonstrated exceptional integrity, who have made difficult choices in the name of doing what is right, who have shown the kind of moral courage that defined Beatrice's life. And Ricardo, my son, became involved in documenting Beatrice's story. He worked with a filmmaker to create a short documentary about what had happened, about how a family had chosen silence over truth, and about what it took to finally break that silence. The documentary was never meant to be a major release. It was created for family members, for relatives, for anyone who wanted to understand our family's journey through this reckoning. But what surprised us was that people outside the family connected with the story. People who had experienced family trauma, people who had been rejected for speaking truth, people who had made difficult moral choices and had been punished for them. These people found something in Beatrice's story that resonated with their own experiences. The documentary was shared. It was watched. It became a way of validating the experiences of people all over the country who had faced similar situations. For me personally, the inheritance changed my life, but not in the way that money typically changes people's lives. The inheritance didn't make me wealthier in a financial sense. I had already lived a comfortable life, but it made me wealthier in terms of purpose. It gave me a responsibility that I had never anticipated, a mission that I had never sought, but that I now understood was mine to carry. The real gift that Beatrice gave me wasn't the money. The real gift was the opportunity to be honest with my family. The real gift was the chance to tell the truth. The real gift was the possibility of transformation, not of the past, because the past cannot be changed, but of the present and the future. I think often about what would have happened if I had simply taken the money and kept Beatrice's story to myself. I would have been financially secure. I would have been comfortable. I would have been able to retire early, to travel, to live a more luxurious life, but I would have been complicit in maintaining the lie. I would have been choosing my own comfort over Beatrice's memory. I would have been perpetuating the same silence that had destroyed her life. Instead, I chose truth. And yes, that choice has been difficult. It has created conflict within my family. It has forced people to confront uncomfortable realities about themselves and about those they loved. It has required me to have difficult conversations, to revisit painful memories, to acknowledge my own complicity in a family system that had been deeply unjust. But I also chose empowerment. I chose to give Beatrice's story the weight it deserved. I chose to honor her memory by speaking about what she did and why it mattered. I chose to use my privilege as someone still alive, still connected to the family, to amplify the voice of someone who could no longer speak for herself. My mother passed away 6 months ago. She was 87, and she had lived long enough to see the foundation established, long enough to see the first scholarship awarded in Beatrice's name, long enough to know that her daughter's story was finally being honored and acknowledged. In her final days, she told me that she could finally rest, that she could face whatever came next with a clear conscience, because she had done what she could to make things right. She couldn't restore the years that were lost. She couldn't give Beatrice back her family, but she could acknowledge what had been wrong, and she could work to ensure that what happened to Beatrice wouldn't happen again to someone else. When I think about Beatrice now, I don't think about the aunt I barely knew. I think about the woman she became. I think about her courage. I think about her choice. I think about the fact that she made the moral decision, the difficult decision, the decision that cost her everything, and she lived with the consequences of that choice for decades. She didn't make it dramatic. She didn't make it performative. She simply did what she believed was right, and she lived with the consequences. And that, I think, is what I've learned from inheriting Beatrice's money. The real inheritance wasn't financial. The real inheritance was the understanding that doing the right thing matters, that speaking truth matters, that honoring the people who make difficult choices matters. The real inheritance was the knowledge that family loyalty doesn't mean protecting lies. Family loyalty means being honest with each other, even when that honesty is painful. Family loyalty means supporting each other in making moral choices, even when those choices have difficult consequences. I think about what would have happened if my family had supported Beatrice instead of rejecting her. What if my father, instead of disowning her, had stood beside her? What if my grandfather had simply accepted responsibility for what he had done instead of asking his daughter to keep silent? What if my family had recognized that Beatrice's choice was the right one and had honored her for making it? Beatrice could have had a very different life. She could have had family support during the difficult aftermath of the trial. She could have had relationships, connections, a sense of belonging. She could have lived as herself rather than as someone hiding from her past. But that didn't happen, and I can't change that. What I can do is ensure that it becomes part of our family story. What I can do is make sure that Beatrice is no longer invisible, that her name is spoken at family gatherings, that her choice is honored and acknowledged. What I can do is use my position to amplify her voice and to ensure that future generations understand what she did and why it mattered. I sometimes imagine Beatrice reading all of this. I imagine her knowing that finally, her family understands. Finally, they see her. Finally, they recognize that she was right. And I hope that somehow, in whatever form consciousness takes after death, Beatrice knows that she was not forgotten. She was not erased. She mattered. This is what I want to say to anyone who is watching this and who might be experiencing something similar. If you have been rejected by your family for doing the right thing, know that you were not wrong. If you have chosen truth over loyalty to a lie, know that your choice mattered. If you have sacrificed your family relationships for your integrity, know that that sacrifice had meaning. And if you are part of a family that has rejected someone for their honesty, that has chosen silence over truth, that has protected lies at the expense of people who deserved better, know that it's not too late. It's never too late to acknowledge what happened. It's never too late to tell the truth. It's never too late to honor the person who had the courage to do what was right, even though it cost them everything. Beatrice waited for decades. She waited and she hoped, and she eventually prepared a message to be delivered after her death, because she still believed that one day someone in the family would want to know. One day someone would be brave enough to listen. One day someone would be willing to tell the truth. And in the end, her faith in that possibility was not misplaced. It took a long time. It took the structure of an inheritance to make it happen. It took my need for money to transform into my desire for truth. But eventually, someone listened. Eventually, the story was told. Eventually, Beatrice was not forgotten. That is the power of truth. That is the power of choosing to see people who have been made invisible. That is the power of having the courage to speak, even when that speaking challenges everything your family has decided to believe. Final disclaimer. This is a fictional drama created for entertainment, not a real personal account. While it explores authentic themes of family betrayal, moral courage, financial inheritance, elder empowerment, and the weight of family secrets, all characters, situations, revelations, and events described in this story are entirely invented for narrative purposes. The character Marcia, her family members, her inheritance, and all the circumstances surrounding the discovery of Beatrice's story are products of creative fiction. This narrative is designed to resonate emotionally with audiences who have experienced family conflict, been rejected for speaking truth, or struggled with the tension between family loyalty and personal integrity. The story maintains complete transparency about its entirely fictional nature, while exploring themes that reflect real human experiences and real family dynamics that many people have faced. No part of this story should be understood as a factual account or as based on real events. This is fiction, created for dramatic and entertainment purposes.